So tonight's topic is going against the grain. But who decides in what way the grain flows? And does identifying the direction of the grain really matter anyway? What role does this grain play in influencing the way that we think, the actions that we take? I'd like to play with these three questions for a little while here and have some fun with them, so hopefully you'll come along for the ride. Let's start at the beginning. Who decides what way the grain flows? Well, I don't know about you, but when I start thinking about a grain and going against the grain, I have images pop into my mind. And this is the first one that I thought of, right? Going against the grain. This crazy fish and all of its siblings every year do the same nutty thing. What do? Well, let's take the most difficult route we can to get where we need to go. Now, for those of you who study physics or have expertise in logic, you know that this fish is going against the stream, against the grain, if you will. But what if you were the salmon? You are the salmon, and you know that the continuance of your species depends on you getting to that spawning ground every year. You must return to that place. You really don't care which way the water's going. Against you, with you, sideways, up, down, it makes no difference. The direction of the water is irrelevant. I'm going to that place because that's who I am. So you could make a case, if you're the salmon, that the water is going against you. Very interesting, Neil. That's nature. Very entertaining. Give me something else. Early in the 1960s, a young woman, black woman, decided to sit in a place in a bus that by rule was designated for white people. Now, if we're going to accept the definition of the grain being an accepted protocol, a way of things being done, it has some infrastructure, it has some power behind it, then you can make the argument, well, yeah, she was going against the grain because the rules said you can't sit there. But what if you were Rosa Parks? From her point of view, her thought process was, yes, I know what the rules say. They're not right. This can't be. I've read the documents of our founding fathers. We're not honoring them. She was answering a calling that may have been contrary to what was on a piece of paper, but she knew what was right. So I would make a case that the way she was behaving, that actually what was in place was going against what was right. What's my point? Who decides which way the grain flows? I would argue it's a matter of perspective. So let's move on. Does identifying the direction of the grain really matter at all? Well, as you can see so far, I tend to think in images. And so I start wrestling with this question, and a bunch of pictures pop into my head. Because I'm only somewhat sane, this is what I settled on. Now, very quickly, in case you can't see in the back, we've got two axes here. Positive outcomes, negative outcomes, with the grain, against the grain. I'm going to start in the upper right-hand corner and move clockwise and explain these images to you. And perhaps it'll help us answer the question that I posed. The upper right-hand corner is a fellow named Dr. Martin Seligman. He's at the University of Pennsylvania. In the late 1990s, he brought forward a different form of psychology. It's referred to as positive psychology. Now, for generations before, the current, the grain, the accepted practice, the infrastructure, was that we dealt with psychology from a form of corrective action, identifying where we have developmental needs and fixing them. Well, along comes Dr. Seligman and says, no, I want to go the different way. I want to identify what everyone is great at and teach them to play their exceptional strengths. A little bit counter to what was before, right? So he's going against the grain. Well, although there are some proponents and some counter to this, this has opened up a whole new generation of research into human development. Went against the grain, positive outcome. Lower right-hand corner. Most of you looking out in the room here, you have no idea what I'm about to talk about. But in 1985, the most powerful soft drink company in the world made a huge mistake. They were the power broker. 26% of market share globally, obviously under competitive pressure. They said, what we're doing now isn't good enough. We are the grain. We are the current. Let's do something else. So they decided to introduce a brand new product to the market, and their slogan became, no Coke, new Coke. Brand new syrup, new formula. To make a long story short, 76 days after they introduced the product, they pulled it from the market and apologized to the public. They went against their own grain and failed. So, if I can go against the grain and have a positive outcome, if I can go against the grain and have a negative outcome, what do I do with that? So let's jump over to a scenario that you're probably more familiar with. 2009, the third largest bankruptcy in the history of the United States, General Motors. Here's an organization that had an established protocol, a power base, a way of doing business. That despite the way the competition was entering the market, it did not upgrade their technology. It did not change their manufacturing practices. They did not modify their financing models. And what happened? Eventually, the government had to bail them out. On the road to recovery? Yes, but they stayed the course. They stayed with the grain. Terrible outcome. The upper left-hand corner, for those of you who aren't football fans, this year the Super Bowl was won by the Baltimore Ravens. Now, if you follow football, there's a conventional wisdom. There's an accepted practice on how to run your offense. It's known as a pocket passer quarterback, which means the primary job of the quarterback is you take the center, you step back, and you throw forward passes down to your receivers. That's the way the NFL has been successful for years and years and years and years. Well, starting a few years ago, a new type of offense has emerged, adopted by Seattle, Washington, San Francisco, whereby the quarterback becomes a dual threat. He can either pass or he can run. He's equally adept at both. So this going against the grain new offense has been making some headway in the NFL. Well, the Ravens had an option to do that, and they didn't. They decided to stay the course. And as I mentioned, this year they won the Super Bowl, interestingly enough, beating San Francisco, who had this new style of offense. Now, are there other factors involved? Of course. But here's the point I'm trying to make. Does identifying the direction of the grain really matter? And what we see is whether I go with the grain or against the grain, I can have a positive outcome or a negative outcome. So, what role does this grain play in influencing the way we think and, more importantly, the way we act? The message I want to leave tonight is this. A grain is relevant when it's time for you to execute upon what it is you want to do. Certainly, there are external forces that you have to navigate and manage in order to get things done. But never, ever, ever, and I will agree with some of the earlier speakers, should the grain dictate what it is you want to do. It may influence your how, but it should never dictate the what. Where does the what come from? Right here. The what comes from personal passion, beliefs, values. That's what drives where you need to go and where you plant your stake. So what I'm going to do real quickly here, and for those of you taking notes, get ready, this will be rapid fire, is I'm going to show you some exercises, activities, things that you can do on your own to get clarity about who you are. We all spend a lot of time dealing with external information, especially those of you who grew up looking at screens. There's always being things pushed at you. What I'm going to show you now is how do you get clear on who you are, which becomes where you move forward from. Ready? Rapid fire. Simple activity. You draw a circle. Take that circle. You break it into pieces of a pie. And those pieces of the pie represent groups who have influenced you to date. Family, religion, school, sports, whatever they are. When you're done, you have a picture of you that may reveal something you hadn't seen before. If you Google IAT and Harvard, you'll come to an electronic test, if you will, that reveals your hidden biases. It will tell things to you that you probably don't know about how you interact with others. It's a very eye-opening device. Third activity, very simple. We can all draw a horizontal line, right? Yes, we are Gettysburg College students. We can draw a line. The left side is the day you were born. Over here with the tip of the arrow is today. Start when you were born and make a little note along these lines at an event that was significant to you. Something happened, an experience, meeting someone, whatever. When you sit back and look at that life stream, we call it, it will tell you a great deal about who you are and what you value. These sound simple. I'm telling you, they have an impact. And fourth, before you giggle, I actually use this with executives that I work with. I ask them to write their obituary. And if the notion of an obituary is a little bit uncomfortable to you, you can replace that with, what would you like to have read at your retirement party? The idea is the same. Put on a document how it is that you want to be remembered and live your life with that serving as your North Star. There's no cost to doing these things, folks. It gives you clarity on who you are. And for those of you here at Gettysburg College, if you work with the Garthwait Leadership Center, they can help you. Now, if you want to get some additional assistance on these type of things, here's some other ideas. A 360-degree survey is an instrument whereby you evaluate yourself along certain behaviors and have people who know you provide the same evaluation. You'll be surprised how the perspectives enlighten what's really going on. Second, Dr. Michael Curtin created a continuum on how we all go about solving problems or how we approach creativity. And by using his instrument, you see where you fall in that continuum. It's a very valuable piece of insight. I would imagine most of you are familiar with Myers-Briggs personality type indicator, right? It's been around a long time. Very insightful piece of information that measures you on 4 different dimensions. And last, certainly not least, this is connected, although it was created by Don Clifton, it's back to this field of positive psychology. There's an instrument you can take that tells you what are your 5 greatest gifts. You didn't have to build them. You don't have to develop them. You don't have to put them in a blue book. There's no test. These are things that you are very, very good at. Very, very insightful piece of information. Okay, Neil, that sounds really academic. Why'd you tell us this? The question I posed to you was, what role does the grain play in influencing our thoughts and, more importantly, our actions? My suggestion is the grain is how you have to navigate those external forces on how to get something done. But the what that you want to do has to come from you. Still sounds theoretical, Neil. Can you give me an example? I believe that I can. I don't think that he woke up every morning and said, I think I'm going to go against the grain today. I don't think that's what he did. I don't think he said, I'm going to go with the grain today. I don't think that's what he thought about. There was something else driving it. This young woman, and I can only say young because she's my age, and by the way, Daryl, I'll see you're 50 and raise you a few. Right? In 1996, she generated what then was the largest result of a lawsuit in the history of the United States, $333 million. What's really important about that, though, is she didn't have one lick of legal training, not one course. So talk about going against the grain. She was so far outside the establishment, she didn't know where it was. So do you really think the grain was a factor in her committing to help this community who had been wronged by a power company? I'll ask you the same question I did about Martin Luther King Jr. Do you really think what drove him was, am I with the grain or against the grain today? You with me? And of course, my favorite. Who would imagine that in a society like ours, a 4-year-old girl eventually becomes the catalyst for what is now a $55 million organization that's committed to wipe out pediatric cancer as we know it? Do you really think she was struggling with, am I with the grain or against the grain? I don't think so. You could probably come up with your own examples. These are just 4 that I use, but I wanted to illustrate the point that what we do comes from something different than this grain. The grain becomes important when I have to implement what I want to do. So let's recap. Who decides which way the grain flows? I would suggest to you it's a matter of perspective. Does identifying the direction of the grain really matter? Well, we see that whether I'm with the grain or against the grain, I could have a positive outcome or a negative outcome. Well, then what role does this grain play? How does it influence my thoughts and my actions? And I think I've been clear on that point. Hopefully, this gives you a slightly different perspective on the role and the value of the grain. Have a good evening.